If you didn't grab one, or Marlon has one, this inspired this sermon. And just a quick refresher. Last time I explained, this was from a couple of years back, and when I was trying to figure out what I was going to preach on, I found this list of sermons that had been, or not sermons, scriptures that had been helpful to me, and so I was like, oh, I could turn this into a sermon. So that's where these came from. We already went over several of them last time. This is part 2. The 2-part, so this is the last of this. So if you're wondering, like, oh, I see some verses on here we didn't go over, it was because it was in the previous sermon. But all the verses that I'm using are there for today and what I went over previously. Today, the sermon's entitled Finding Light in the Darkness. Last time we talked about God's hope or God's healing for the brokenhearted, and we talked about how we're not alone. But this time, we're talking about what happens when bad things happen and hurt continues to linger on. What about the future? Not just when things happen. What about in our darkest moments? If you've ever lost somebody, you're going to know what I'm talking about here. That feeling of just, no matter what the weather is. And today when I looked at the weather, I was like, oh, this is such a lovely day for such a deep topic that we're about to talk to. But then I was like, you know what, this is really fair. Because a lot of people, when they've lost or been hurt, a very beautiful day doesn't feel so beautiful. It doesn't feel so light. It can still feel dark internally, even if there's actual light around you. And I know if you've lost somebody, you know what I'm talking about. It seems like the world is going on and your world has been stopped. And I remember when I lost my dad as a teenager, I remember that sense of just wanting things to go back to normal. I just needed life to continue on. I was 17 when he passed away, and I still had high school to finish up. And I just remember being like, I just want to be treated like everybody else. And it's not that I didn't want it to ignore that I had lost my dad, but the first few weeks back, people were, talking about me and talking about what happened. And when you have a loss that like is a community loss and people know, they knew us, they knew our family, and they're like, oh, and he died suddenly. Everyone's like, there's a ripple effect. And we know this very well in a small town here too, when people have been lost, maybe well-intending people, are trying to come up to you and how are you doing? How's whatever? And it can feel very overwhelming. And at least for me as a teenager, I just was like, please just treat me normal. Just treat me like a normal person. And it was particularly hard during that season because we had lost, many of you know my story, I won't go into the whole thing. We had lost several people in my family before that. We had lost my grandpa 6 months before. We had a devastating loss a couple of years before that where we lost a very young cousin. And we had some other extended family losses. So it just seemed like we were just getting hit. And yet during that time, while I wanted to be as normal as possible, I never lost hope. And that inspired part of this question, where do we find hope when that hurt lingers? Because I wasn't just like when I went back to school the next week after my dad died, I told my mom, I was like, I'm going to go back to school on Monday. I need to be back into normal routine. I'm not saying that's the way everybody's going to do it. That's just what I knew I needed to do. I was like, I need to be back in the routine. I need to feel like things are going to be okay. But did that mean that I was suddenly healed up and I wasn't bothered anymore that I'd lost him? No. Right? It took me a long time. And if you ask my family, it took our family years, and I'm not joking when I say this, years to deal with the loss of that and the fallout of that. I'm questioning whether some people have even moved past that, if you know what I'm talking about. But it took us years, at least in my core family, to feel like were able to see the light of day. Some of us took a lot longer than others. But during that time, like I said, as a family too, we never lost hope. Was it difficult? Absolutely. Were there moments where we're like, man, I wish we didn't have to do this? Yes. But here's what I find hope in, and this is what I love about these verses. And so I'm bringing this to you to think about, that there's hope. There's hope in a number of things, but there's hope in these 3 points that I'm going to make today. There's hope in God's unchanging character. There's hope in God's faithful promises. And there's hope in God's ultimate victory. Like all of those things should give us a sense of like, no matter how much we are hurting, there is hope for us. So we're going to look at our first verse, and this is Lamentations 3:21-23. And I'm sure you're going to at least know part of this one. Yet this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed. For his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. I mean, we all know that song, Great is your faithfulness, right? That hymn comes right from this. But what does this verse come in? Where's the context of this verse? This is actually in context of, this is Jeremiah, and this is in the midst of Jerusalem's destruction. So this is not, and Lamentations is a hard book, just forewarning you, read through that. Lamentations is what it sounds like. It laments, sadness, yes. And yet, in here, there's little pockets of this type of stuff that says, he's not done, by the way, in Lamentations 3, but he says, yet, after all the things that he's describing, in the midst of the chaos, Jerusalem's destruction, devastation, I mean, unimaginable things to our minds here, probably. And yet, what does he say that he's going to call to mind? He says, yet I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. What does he have hope in? The Lord's great love. Right? And we know that over and over in the Bible points us to God is love. And that even in our darkest season, God offers unshakable hope and faithful love. I mean, that's just his character. Baseline character. I mean, that's the amazing part there. God's love never fails. And what does it say about that? It says, and it's also new every morning. And every time I hear this verse, I don't know if anybody here is an Anne of Green Gables fan, just follow me. And if you're not, it's okay. I will not stay here very long. But I remember there's a scene in Anne of Green Gables, because Anne's always kind of messing things up a little bit. She's a fellow redhead, so that's why, of course, I loved the story as a kid. And I love the movie, the Megan Follows one. Anyways, because I know there's other versions out there. Thank you for those of you giving me a nod, you know what I'm talking about. So, in the movie, when Anne has messed up again and Marilla's going up to talk to her, and she basically says something like this, tomorrow's a new day and we can start over. And I think Anne may play on that a little and say it's a new day with fresh mistakes in it to make. But the idea was this, that we get another chance every morning. And this is kind of what Jeremiah says, kind of with what Anne and Marilla were talking about. Yet every morning that faithfulness is there. Every morning we get a new start. And also what I love about this is that he cares for us right now, right? If it's new every morning and it's a constant supply, it's never ending, he cares right now. He doesn't just care about the past that happened to you. He doesn't just care about what's going to happen to you. He cares about you right this second. And in fact, the Hebrew word for this steadfast or love comes in with this word, steadfast, covenant love. It's not based on our performance. And it's not based on how we feel, which is the beauty of this, right? If we are feeling low, if we're feeling down, we're feeling grief or whatever, it's not based on any of that. It's not based on you feeling good, feeling happy, feeling joyful or whatever. It's great if we feel those things. We tend to like those things. But it's saying no matter what, God is still love. He's still faithful. He's still, I love that word steadfast. He's still consistent. Now, 1 Peter 5:7 says this about him. Cast all your anxiety on him because he cares for you, right? What did I just say a moment ago? He cares for you right now. Why can we cast that onto him? Because he cares for you right this moment. And it points out all your anxiety. You can insert a number of different things here. Cast all your grief. Cast all your sorrows. Cast all your, yes, the cares. Whatever, yes, that's another variation. Cares sums it up very well, right? Cares or anything that's bothering you, we can say, here you go, God. And why does it say we can do that? Not because it says, we're going to hand it to God and he's a vending machine. He's like, I'll fix it here. Although certainly he fixes some things. And other times they're not fixed, at least not in our eyes, or we can't see that they're fixed. It doesn't say cast them on him because he is going to just answer and do whatever left and right. It says do that because he cares for you. Cast these things on him because he cares about you. It's like bringing something that's on your mind to a loved one, whether that's a spouse, a friend, a family member, or whatever, and you bring it to them. Why do you bring it to them? Why do you even feel like you can do that, right? Because you know them. You know that there's not likely to be anything you're going to say that's going to be like they're going to turn away from you. Like if you feel secure in that relationship, you're going to come and be like, oh, this was a really hard day, and this happened, and that happened, and maybe you said or did something that wasn't good, and they're still going to be like, doesn't mean they're always going to agree with you, but they're still going to be there and going to listen to you, right? Because they care for you, you know that you can bring stuff to them. And that's what it tells us about who God is. If we as humans can do that, and micro pieces most of the time. God can do that infinitely. Infinitely. So here's the thing. We just looked at having hope in God's unchangeable character. He is love, and he is always going to be that. But he doesn't leave us just with that, too. He also gives us promises, and there's many, many promises in the Bible, okay? So what we're going to look at today, some of these are going to look like promises. Some of these are just verses related to that. And again, you can come up with many, many other promises that God has said in the Bible. But this is Hebrews 11:1, just to get us started, to look at what the foundation is. Hebrews 11, by the way, is the faith chapter, so this will be somewhat familiar. And also, maybe you'll recall, at least a couple years ago, I did a whole series on Hebrews 11. We went bit by bit. We broke this down so many different times that I expect you all to still remember the chart that I had up there. And it's okay if you don't. But I still remember the chart that I had up here, and I'm going to try not to go too far into that, but to keep it to what we're talking about today. So it's Hebrews 11:1. Now faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. And this is the part where we really broke this down. We're going to pause here. Faith is confidence in what? What we hope for, and assurance about what we do not see. Faith is not wishful thinking. It's confident assurance. Based on what? Yeah, based on what we already know about who God is, and based on what he does and what he follows through with. In fact, the rest of Hebrews 11 brings us men and women throughout the Bible. We tend to call them heroes of faith. All the different stories, Abraham, David, etc. They're being pulled in here. And they're not being pulled in there because they're amazing. Like, we tend to sort of talk about them that, like, oh, these heroes of faith, they're so great. And I'm not saying that they didn't do great things. But they're in there, they probably would all admit they're in there not because of their own doing. They're in there because of God's faithful doing, right? And they're in there not because they had easy lives. All those people that if you go to Hebrews 11 and you look at the names in there, you know the stories well enough, you're like, yeah, Abraham didn't have it easy. He was traveling around. He didn't really have a place to call home. He lived a nomadic life, and I know that was kind of the lifestyle there, but he left a place where there was like home, and he could kind of be there. And he's following God's lead around with this promise that he's going to have this child with his wife, his wife is barren, with this promise that he's going to own this land, which he doesn't own any of the land that he's wandering around on. And he definitely doesn't get to actually see when they own the land. He does eventually get to see the child of promise, but that's not before he messes up a couple of times. So Abraham's not in there, and that's just one example. Abraham's not in there because he did great and he had a fantastically easy life. And it's just easy to be faithful. I guarantee you that Abraham would be saying, if anybody were to ask him, we get to heaven, we can ask him, he's going to say, when we ask him, hey, what was that like for you? He's probably going to be like what Marlon talked a little bit about, like those hardships were nothing, but also be like, what held him through those times was God's promise, right? God gave him very specific promises there, but God makes promises that are more general to us. He's not promising you and I today, like, here's a child of promise for you, and you're going to own this land. Those promises are not directed towards us, but God does actually promise us land, believe it or not necessarily like the way Abraham does. And he does promise us deliverance. What was having the child of promise about? It was about creating and continuing on the line for the Messiah to come through so that he could save us, which happened. So he does promise us a way out, right? And there's many, many other examples that we could look up of examples of hope. One of them Marlon had mentioned, is not mentioned in Hebrews 11, but I will just summarize briefly when he was talking about the story of Samuel and his mother Hannah. What was she basing her hope on, right? She's coming year after year. She desperately wants this child. She can't have this child. And God uses Eli, who does not have the easiest of lives, as we have heard in Marlon's sermon there too. But when he realizes, he doesn't know the extent of what she's praying for, right? When she comes in and she's very distraught, and he's like, may God, grant you whatever. God's working right through him there to say, yeah, this thing that you want, this child that you want so desperately you'll have. And she does. She holds right on to that until she, I don't know how many months, at least 9 months, but, however long it took for that to happen. And then she gives him back. right? She gives back the one thing that she's like, I so desperately want this son, I want this child. And yet she doesn't even get to stick around to see him grow up. And that does not say she wasn't involved in his life. That's not the point. But he's not there with her day to day after a certain point. Right? That is not easy. But she does that based on a promise. Both ways. She made a promise to God. God kept a promise to her. And she said, I'm going to give him back to you. That was out of her own heart. It wasn't because God said, I want you to give me him, in this case. She gave him back to God, if you will, in the best way that she knew how, which was to have him serve in the temple. And he went on to be a mighty prophet, right? His mother's prayers, you want to talk about mother praying, right? He went on to that, and I know, because we see how Samuel's life went, we know that all the stories and the promises and all that hope was passed on down to him, and he understood it. He understood it at a young age, and definitely as he grew older and was sharing with the people around him, people would come to him to hear more about who this God was, this God of this unchangeable character, this God who is promising deliverance, promising hope, promising a future to them. See, his faithfulness, not ours, God's faithfulness is our anchor. So here's a verse that you might not expect to see in a sermon about hearts that are hurting, but I think it is relevant. And it's 1 Corinthians 10:13. And like I said, I got this straight out of the list that I made at the time. So at the time that I wrote this list, I've felt a lot of comfort from this. And it says, no temptation has overtaken you except what is common to mankind. And God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. Oof. Okay, we tend to hear this one just about the idea of temptations, but here's the thing. It tells us that God sets limits on our trials. Now, we may not agree with God as to when those trials should begin, that God is in control and sets limits on them. And it also tells us that he provides us, air quotes here, a way out. There's always some kind of escape route. And I think that is so wonderful to realize that God has said, no matter what you're going through, if you're hurting and you're in a deep, dark pit, he's saying, this will not last forever. This will not be forever. And he provides us an escape. Now, that doesn't mean when I say escape, because many, many of us, y'all know my role as a counselor, and many, many people who don't want to deal with grief. And then they're sitting in my office and they're like, I don't want to talk about this grief that I've been through. I don't talk about the person that I lost, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And everybody's different, and I don't force people to. But there is something about actually working with those feelings that you have. And so I'm not saying that God's like, oh, just ignore that you have this grief and be happy as if nothing is happening. We're not really created that way. You have a feeling. Feelings sometimes linger for a bit. They don't stay forever. Feelings sometimes linger for a bit, and we have a tendency to be like, I don't want to deal with you. But God is saying here, I'm going to help you deal with that. I'm going to help you through whatever this season is. So sometimes I think the escape route is not that, oh, you're going to just feel wonderful and fabulous after this terrible thing. Sometimes I think that what he's promising is, I'm going to work with you as we work our way out. Back to where we started. You're not alone in getting out. There is hope. There is an end in sight. And I think that's one of the most beautiful promises, is to know there's an end. There's an end in sight to that. And in fact, he says in John 10:10 here, that I have come that they may have life and have it abundantly. So he's not like, oh, I've come so that you can just be tempted, and we're always going to be walking this hard path. Are there going to be hard things? Yes. And I don't doubt that some of us have had harder lives than others. This is not a comparison game. Everybody's got things to go through. But definitely there are some folks that have had a lot more on their plate. I've met many, many people that I have thought, you have a lot on your plate. I can't even begin to imagine all the stuff that has happened. Sitting in my office and I'm going, wow, that's a lot. But here's the thing. God doesn't say, oh, I'm going to just leave you there, because I came to give you life. So if he came to give you life, the opposite means the devil's here to mess it up, give death, give destruction, etc. So you have to put those two things in context. But God's purpose here is to give us abundant life. And it's not about an absence of problems but fullness despite problems. In fact, one of the things, and I just thought about it last night when I was going over the sermon one more time, and I was like, I should have went on my computer and looked for this, but I didn't feel like doing it. So you're going to get it verbally. One of the things that I have of my dad's still, and this is a couple of years before he passed, my dad should have been like a motivational speaker or something like that. He was always like very intentional about like encouraging us as kids. That's like one of my core memories about him. He was very intentional. And I think I was headed into high school, went to a boarding academy. And so it was my first year away from home. And he gave me this letter. And in the letter, it had this quote. And the quote said almost exactly, this is what last night I was like, I remember this. Now I gotta go find it. But I didn't find it for you guys. But it said something about this, about hardships. And it said something very similar. Not the absence of problems, but the fullness despite problems. So imagine a 14-year-old getting that from her dad, an encouraging thing that says, hey, you're going to have problems. You're going to be away from home. Mom and dad are not going to be near you. But God is still with you. And a good life is not one without problems. It's working through those with God. And I think, wow, that's exactly what God does for us now, right? Just like my earthly father sent me this encouragement of like, it's going to be tough. It's going to be tough. And in his case, he can't, not here now, right? So he can't always be with you. God can't always be with us. So that's the beauty of that. Our Heavenly Father can always be with us. And so he's saying, yeah, there's going to be problems, but that's not what I'm about. We're going to be working through. You can still find life within this. And it says a life that overflows even in difficult seasons. I don't know about you, but that's what I want for my life. Even in difficult seasons, I want to be able to see, okay, God is still there. He's that, I do mean this, that light at that end of the tunnel. When that darkness is closing around, I want to still be able to say, yeah, it might seem a ways off there. It seems faint, Lord. Because sometimes he feels close and sometimes he feels far away. Sometimes we don't even feel him at all, which is why we can't base things off of how we feel. We have to base them off of what we know about him, an unchanging God, a loving God who keeps his promises. But he doesn't leave us there. And in fact, we're going to read a couple verses here. This is John 1:5, hence the title of this presentation. The light shines in the darkness, and darkness has not overcome it. If you haven't read John 1, that chapter in a while, go back and read that. That is so beautiful. And the metaphor that's in here, and I love this because here's the thing. Light is always going to win. Darkness can't extinguish light, if you think about that. The literal principle here, if you walk into a dark space and you've got a flashlight, you got a candle, whatever it is that you've got, you go into there. It may still be kind of a dark room, but the darkness doesn't overpower your light. Even that tiny little light gives light within in the darkness. And of course, in this case, the light shining in the darkness is referring to Jesus, referring to our Messiah. And it tells us right away, the darkness cannot overcome it. Jesus has commented on himself as the light of the world. And in fact, there's no situation that is beyond God's ability to illuminate. And there's no situation in which you're sitting there and God can't come to you and figure that out with you. Can't come to you and give you comfort. Can't come to you and give you whatever. All right? I know grief is not necessarily like a problem-solving thing because I'm trying to encompass all kinds of situations. Grief is that feeling that you have when you've lost something. And God can sit there and work in you despite that. Now, Habakkuk 3:17-18. This is another favorite. If you go into the minor prophets. Though the fig tree does not bud and there are no grapes on the vines, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in God my Savior. This is another situation like where we started at looking at Lamentations, where Jeremiah is in the destruction zone, and he's going, okay, I'm still not helping you. Habakkuk sets this up. Though the fig tree does not bud, there are no grapes on the vine. What? There's no food. Though there's no food and there's famine in the land, we need food to survive. And he's saying, though I can't see, right? He's looking around. You imagine this visual. He's like, I see the fig trees, but they're not budding, which means we're not going to get any figs. And I don't see any grapes on the vines. Yet I'm going to rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in God my Savior. And we can do this ultimately. Fast forward into Revelation. And I'm not going to pick a particular verse out of this, but just getting the narrative. You guys have heard this many, many times. We ought to rename that book Jesus Wins. right? That whole book and that whole thing is telling us ultimately Jesus wins. He's already won, actually. He's just got to finish it all. He's already won, okay? So I'm not saying that he hasn't won. He's already won. It just hasn't been completely rolled out. The victory path hasn't been completely rolled out. But that's what this is all pointing to. Is saying, like, despite what we're in right now, we know that God has already paid the price. He's already won. He's made the path. He's right there. He's like, you can choose the path. You can have joy and you can have an abundant life today, even in the midst of your grief and your sorrow. When I was putting this together, I found this interesting thought here, and it was saying that worship is an act of defiance against despair. And I was like, oh, that's so fascinating. But it makes sense. It actually reminds me of the sermon I did earlier this year on Leah, when we were talking about the difficult situations Leah was in, with Leah from the Jacob, Rachel, Leah love triangle story, basically. But worship as an act of defiance against despair. That even when we're not feeling it, choosing to say, I will praise you, Lord. I will look to you. Finding strength in what God has already said. I know right now that this is tough, God, but I know that in the future, and that may be a ways off, that may be in heaven. I'm not saying things are going to suddenly become easy for you now, but I know that you've already won, and I can hold on to that even in those really dark moments. So I want to get a little practical with this as we're getting ready to wrap up. First, we're going to read 2 Corinthians 1, 3-4. It says this: Praise be to the God and the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of compassion, a God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our troubles, so that we can comfort those in any trouble with the comfort we ourselves receive from God. This is Paul's writings. And I love this because it says, praise God who is a Father of compassion, a God of all comfort, a God who comforts us in our troubles. And then he gets practical and he says, so that we, when we're comforted, can turn around and comfort others. That we, even in the midst of our difficult times, can be a comfort to others. Now, yes, sometimes we need comfort, so I'm not saying, because some of us have this tendency to be like, I'm fine, take care of everybody else and don't take care of yourself. I'm not saying that, and you know who you are out there, because I know there's people like that. I have a tendency to be like this too. So it's not saying ignore your own needs. It's not saying ignore all that. But it is saying that when it makes sense and when you can, and God is pointing that out to you, that God's providing you comfort, and you can turn your stories into kind of like me as a young teenager. One of the inspirations that I had actually after losing my dad was, I was like, I want to be able to help other people who have been through things like this. I wanted to help children who had been through really hard times like this. And that was back at like 17. Now, I did not know how I was going to do that. And I do some of that work now. I help people in so many other ways now too. I don't just do grief work. But that was one of the early inspirations that I was able to see from that. It's like, this really is bad. But I could see already that God was like, you can turn this into something else. In fact, I read a book about a news anchor. I can't remember her name. And she said her mom had told her, she went through double rounds of cancer. And her mom had told her, turn your mess into a message. And I was like, that is actually really great. And so I wanted to look just a little bit at how can we help others? Looking around, how practically can you help others here? And I'm going to give you a couple of tips here. So, be present, be practical, be patient, be prayerful, be sensitive. Some of these probably go without saying, but I'm going to hit them really briefly. Being present is not just about being there, sitting next to the person. And in fact, being present is just being mindful of that person, following the lead of their conversation, and also recognizing when maybe they don't want you to be there, which might sound difficult. But sometimes people need space. So being present may just be saying, hey, I know you're going through a difficult time. If you want, I'm willing to sit here with you. We can sit in silence. Or if you want me to, I can leave you be. And being okay with that. Being practical. Of course, people like to bring meals. Wrangell is famous for this, bringing a bunch of food after something happens. Everyone trying to help out, etc. The one piece I would like to throw in here, though, is maybe thinking about what are other ways besides food's a good one. But depending upon what someone's gone through, sometimes people don't have an appetite. So I'm not saying don't offer food, but being aware of that, or they're getting a ton of other food. Is there other ways that you can help somebody out? Is there other ways that you can be practical? Or bringing a meal months down the road, because everybody brings those meals in that first couple of weeks of that loss. Everybody's bringing stuff over. And again, they may or may not have an appetite. So that who knows what's happening with that food. They're trying to put in the freezer. Bring a meal a couple months later. I mean, do what you need to do at that time to let them know that you're there, but bring them something later saying, I'm still thinking about you. I know it's hard. Those are the things that I hear from people is they go, yeah, everybody's wrapped around you for the first several weeks, and then their life continues on, and here I am. You know, the food stops. People stop checking in with you, stop coming over. So just thinking, like, how can we keep that in our minds? Being patient, right? Grief doesn't have a timeline. What I just said, checking in months later with people. Being prayerful, of course. Putting people in our prayers. If it's somebody who's a fellow believer, or it makes sense to ask, can we pray for something specifically for you during this time? And of course, being sensitive. Trying not to compare grief experiences. Early on, one of the things I noticed in the job that I do, it didn't matter to people many times what loss I had been through. In fact, most people that I've worked with probably don't even know what losses I've been through, because when I'm sitting across from them, I'm like, it is not helpful for me to say, oh, I know how you feel. I lost my dad when I was such and such. That doesn't fly. They don't care at that moment, and I understand that. So I don't mean that in a rude way. I understand that, so I don't bring that up. I just try to be with them wherever. However, there are times where it does make sense. This is where it's being sensitive, to be able to say, this was my experience. Can I share it with you? I don't do that all the time, but sometimes it's helpful. Sometimes people really resonate that they go, oh, wow, this person's been through something too. You know, maybe I can talk to them about this. So here's a couple of things not to say. I just mentioned this one. I think we all know these things. I know how you feel. Doesn't fly for most things, but especially not in this area. Anything that has an at least they went quickly, at least they didn't suffer, at least fill in the blanks, never helpful. And you know, have I ever been guilty of saying some things like this? Yes, they just come out of us, right? We're trying to figure out what to say, something these things come out. So I'm not saying these are irredeemable and you can't like backtrack. You're strong, you'll get through this. Even if somebody is strong and they will get through this, you may want to watch your timing on that one. I'm not saying you can't tell people that they're strong, but maybe in that moment it's not a good time to say that. Maybe later they might need to hear that. That's where the being sensitive is. So this is not a blanket. There's plenty of other things not to say. But here's a few things you can try to say. Again, being sensitive to the person that's around you. I'm here for you. I'm thinking of you and praying for you. Would you like to talk about fill in the blank, whoever it was they lost? I love you if that's appropriate for whatever the situation is at. I know that everybody's a little different about willing to talk about bringing up people's names that they've lost. And I'm very thankful in my family that even now, when my mom was here this last time, we were talking about my dad. She brought up some memory. And I was like, oh yeah, I forgot about that. And I really appreciate that my mom was not like, we are never going to talk about him again. I absolutely have other family members who are like, let's ignore that this ever happened to us kind of situation. But in my immediate family, we were allowed to right away be able to say, hey, remember this or that about dad. And I found it helpful. I know everybody's a little different, but it's nice to at least ask people. Because sometimes people are like, I can't talk about that person right now. And other times people really want to talk about them, want to relive the more pleasant memories, and people don't want to hear it because they're afraid of just bothering them. So being present and being aware. So let's be God's hands and feet to someone who's hurting. What are some ways, thinking about that we can serve, right? What are some ways that we can give hope to people around us, letting them know that we're here and there for them? What are some ways that we need to challenge ourselves to take care of what's happening with us? So this week, what I want us to remember is those 3 points. That God's unchanging character gives us hope. God is love, and that never changes regardless of where we're at. God is faithful to his promises, and that God's ultimate victory over sin, victory over death and the grave, is full of hope for those who believe in him. And I praise God that he is such an amazing, loving God.